I remember the exact moment I said it. The words slipped out, almost as if I had no control over them, but the truth was, they were a reflection of something deeper, something I had felt for a long time. It was a simple statement, really, but it held weight that neither Mark nor I could have anticipated. If I had to choose, I had said, looking over at my husband, my dog would always come first. At the time, I didn't think much of it. It was a casual remark, one of those things you say during a lazy Sunday afternoon when the world outside seems distant, irrelevant. I sat on the couch, my legs curled under me, Max, my dog, by my side, his head resting on my lap. Mark, as usual, sat across from me in his chair, his fingers grazing the rim of his wine glass. Mark didn't respond right away. He simply stared at me, a look of confusion briefly crossing his face before it morphed into something more akin to annoyance. His gaze lingered longer than it should have, making the atmosphere in the room feel thicker than it was before. The air between us grew colder, a silent tension wrapping around us, but I didn't think much of it at the time. Max had been with me long before Mark entered my life. He was the one constant, the one who had seen me through countless sleepless nights, heartbreaks, and loneliness. I loved Mark, of course. I loved him in ways I didn't think were possible. But Max had been there when I was broken, when I didn't even know how to love myself. In a way, that bond was unshakable. "Are you serious?" Mark asked, his voice cool, almost amused. I glanced at him, my fingers absent-mindedly running through Max's fur. "Of course, I'm serious. You know what he means to me." Mark set his wine glass down with a soft clink, leaning back in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't know, Clara. I think you're taking this a little too far." I frowned, feeling the irritation beginning to creep up. Taking what too far? Mark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pushed himself out of his chair, pacing around the living room. The movement made me uneasy. When Mark started pacing, it usually meant he was annoyed, really annoyed, and not in a way that was easy to fix. "I just don't get it," he muttered, half to himself, as he stopped by the window and stared out. "You'd choose him over me? Over us?" I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him it wasn't about choosing anyone over the other. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how true my words had been. If it came down to it, if I had to choose, Max would win every time. He wasn't just a pet to me, he was family. "I'm not saying I'd choose him over you, Mark." But I trailed off, unsure of how to finish my thought without sounding defensive. "He's been with me for years. You know that." Mark sighed and rubbed his temples. "This isn't about Max. It's about you, Clara. You're so caught up in him, you're forgetting about us. About what we're supposed to be building together." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could say anything, Max suddenly lifted his head and let out a soft bark, as though sensing the tension in the room. I scratched behind his ears, his comfort a balm I didn't realize I needed. But Mark seemed to take that as another cue. His eyes flicked to Max, and I saw the irritation flaring in them. "I'm starting to feel like I'm just a second choice. That I'll always be second to your dog," he said, the words sharp and cutting. I felt my stomach twist. "That's not fair, Mark. You know that's not how I feel." But it didn't seem to matter. Mark stood there, looking at me with a mixture of hurt and anger in his eyes, before shaking his head and turning toward the door. "I need some space," he muttered before walking out without another word. I stared at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. Had I really said something that hurt him so much? Or was this a deeper issue between us that I hadn't seen? As the silence settled around me, I realized that the words I had spoken, so casually, so lightly, had triggered something in Mark. Something more than just a simple disagreement over a dog. It felt like a crack, small but unmistakable, forming in the foundation of our relationship. Max, oblivious to the storm swirling around us, curled up beside me again, resting his head on my lap. I ran my fingers through his fur, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that things had just shifted between Mark and me. I didn't know if it was something that could be fixed, or if the damage had already been done. Later that evening, when Mark returned, there was a coldness in the air that hadn't been there before. He didn't look at me the same way. He didn't speak with the same warmth. And for the first time in our marriage, I felt like a distance had formed between us, an invisible line that neither of us could cross. We didn't talk about it again that night. But I could tell that the moment had left its mark, deepening a rift I hadn't fully understood existed. It wasn't just about Max anymore. It was about something else. Something bigger. I wanted to believe it was just a misunderstanding. But deep down, I feared that the words I had spoken had changed everything between us. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure if I regretted them. The days after that conversation with Mark felt different. Every time I tried to look at him, I saw the weight of our earlier exchange hanging in the air, an invisible barrier between us. Mark no longer met my eyes in the same way. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't warm either. It was as though we were two strangers coexisting in the same space, each lost in their own thoughts, waiting for the other to make the first move. But neither of us did. Max, of course, remained blissfully unaware of the tension. He would still sit by my side, his wagging tail brushing against my legs whenever I moved. If only life were as simple for us humans. I couldn't help but wonder if Mark saw Max as the wedge between us, though I couldn't bring myself to ask. It was as if speaking the words would make it all real, and I wasn't ready to face that reality. It wasn't just Mark's coldness that bothered me. There was something more insidious creeping in, something I couldn't put my finger on but could sense in the small moments. His frustration was no longer just directed at me, but at everything. I could hear it in the way he spoke to people on the phone, the way he threw himself into his work without a second thought. It was like he was retreating into himself, closing off the part of him that had once been so open, so affectionate. And then there was Julia, Mark's younger sister. She was always around when things started to feel fragile. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. But when she began showing up more frequently, her passive-aggressive remarks, always cleverly disguised as innocent questions, made me wonder if she was playing a more active role in the rift between Mark and me. She knew how to push his buttons, knew exactly when to show up to stir things up. It wasn't blatant, nothing that would make Mark see what was happening, but it was there, lurking beneath the surface. One evening, about a week after the fight, I came home from the grocery store to find Julia sitting in the living room with Mark. She had one of her fake smiles on, the kind that never reached her eyes. She was leaning back on the couch, chatting animatedly as though nothing had changed, as though I didn't exist in a place where words had been spoken and things had been broken. "Clara," Julia said brightly when she saw me. "You're back." I was just telling Mark how I saw this adorable dog in the park today. I cut her off before she could finish. "It's okay, Julia. I don't need to hear about another dog right now." The moment those words left my mouth, I regretted them. But there was a part of me that couldn't stand the way she always tried to use Max as some kind of weapon against me. It was like she enjoyed seeing how uncomfortable I would become whenever the topic came up. She was always so perfect, so put together, and I had to wonder if she thought I was some kind of threat to that. Mark glanced at me, a brief flash of something crossing his face, surprise, maybe. Or maybe disappointment. I couldn't tell anymore. Are you really going to be like this, Clara? He asked, his voice tight. I could hear the annoyance creeping in, as it had so many times before. But this time, there was an edge to it that I hadn't heard before. I'm not being anything, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I just don't want to talk about it. Julia, ever the diplomat, stood up and smiled. Okay, well, I should get going. You two have fun with your conversation. She didn't mean it. I knew she didn't. As soon as the door clicked shut behind her, Mark turned to me, his face drawn and tired. What was that about? I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him that I was frustrated, that I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells around him, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain that the cracks in our marriage felt too deep to fix with just a few apologies or meaningless gestures? That I had tried, I really had, but it didn't seem to matter. I'm tired, Mark, I finally said. Tired of everything. My voice cracked, and I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop the tears from rising. Mark didn't respond. He simply turned away, his back stiff, his jaw clenched. It was as if the distance between us had become something physical, something we could touch and feel. I realized then, with a sinking heart, that he hadn't been listening to me. Not really. He hadn't heard a word I said, not the way I needed him to. I spent the next few days in a quiet sort of despair. Mark kept himself busy with work, and I kept myself busy with the small things, cleaning, cooking, taking care of Max. It was a routine that filled the silence but did nothing to ease the growing emptiness in me. I was losing him, slowly but surely. And it hurt more than I could put into words. I had always believed that love was enough. That, no matter what happened, love would keep us grounded. But now I wasn't so sure. One night, after Mark had stayed out late for a business meeting, I found myself sitting on the couch with Max curled up beside me. I ran my fingers through his fur, comforted by the steady rhythm of his breathing. I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending that everything was fine. Mark was slipping further and further away, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't bring him back. It was then that I realized the truth of what I had said that day. If it came down to it, Max would always come first. Not because he was a replacement for Mark or anyone else, but because Max had never asked me to choose between him and anything else. Max was simple, pure love, and that was something I wasn't sure I had with Mark anymore. I had made a choice, without fully realizing it. A choice that would either tear us apart or break us in ways we couldn't recover from. I just wasn't sure which one it would be. The silence between Mark and me had become unbearable. It was as if we were both living in the same house, breathing the same air, but the bond that had once tied us together was now fraying, coming apart at the edges, like a threadbare blanket that had been used too many times. I could feel it every time I walked into a room. The unspoken tension hung there, thick and oppressive. There were moments when I would catch Mark looking at me, a flash of something in his eyes that I couldn't name, disappointment, perhaps, or resentment, but whatever it was, it made my stomach churn. Max seemed to sense it too. He would follow me around, his gentle eyes watching me with a kind of quiet understanding. I spent my days caring for him, walking him through the park, trying to keep my mind off the growing distance between me and my husband. It was as if Max was the only one who could still make me feel whole. One afternoon, I took Max to the vet. It had been weeks since he'd shown any signs of illness, but something about the way he had been acting lately, slower, more lethargic, made me uneasy. I didn't want to admit it, but I was afraid. Afraid of losing him. Afraid of what would happen to me if he were to slip away. I didn't think I could bear it. The vet confirmed my fears. Max wasn't just slowing down, he was sick. Very sick. He had some sort of aggressive condition that would require intense treatment, but even with that, there was no guarantee he would pull through. The thought of losing him was enough to send me into a tailspin. I clutched Max to my chest, tears streaming down my face as I whispered to him, promising him that I would do everything I could to make him better. But when I got home, it felt as though the world had shifted beneath my feet. Mark was sitting in the living room, his face drawn and weary. He looked up when I entered, his eyes flicking briefly to Max in my arms. I could see that he was trying to read me, trying to figure out what was happening in my head, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. "How is he?" Mark asked quietly, though I could tell that he didn't want to know. It was as if he was asking out of duty, not out of care. "He's sick," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Very sick. We're going to try treatment," but I trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. "I'm not sure what will happen." Mark didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, looking at me with that same unreadable expression. I could feel the coldness between us, and it cut deeper than I expected. I had hoped, foolishly, I now realized, that the news of Max's illness would soften him, bring some compassion back into our relationship. But instead, it only seemed to solidify the chasm between us. "I see," he finally said. "And what does that mean for us, Clara? What does it mean for me?" I blinked, confused by the question. "What do you mean?" Mark stood up, pacing in his usual way. "You're always focused on him. You always put him first, and now you're going to put all of your energy into saving him." He paused, turning to face me, his eyes cold. "And where does that leave me, Clara?" I felt my heart race in my chest, a lump forming in my throat. It was as if the words I had said earlier, those stupid, thoughtless words, had come back to haunt me. It wasn't just about Max anymore. It was about something deeper. Mark wasn't angry with Max. He was angry with me. And I realized, too late, that I had never given Mark the reassurance he needed, the attention he craved. I had been so consumed with my bond with Max that I hadn't noticed the slow erosion of our marriage. "I never meant to hurt you," I said, my voice shaking. "But Max has always been with me. I can't just turn my back on him." Mark's face twisted in frustration. "And I've always been here, too, Clara. But it's like I'm invisible to you. Like I don't matter." The words hit me harder than I expected. "That's not true. I love you." He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "Love doesn't feel like this, Clara. Love isn't choosing someone over everything else. Love isn't living in a house with someone and pretending everything is fine when it isn't." I stood there, paralyzed by his words. For the first time in what felt like forever, I realized that Mark wasn't just mad about Max. He was mad at me. And he had been for a long time. "I can't keep doing this," Mark said quietly, his voice breaking. "I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not. I'm leaving, Clara." The words hit me like a blow to the chest. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. I wanted to beg him to stay, to tell him that I would change, that I would make it work. But I knew, deep down, that it was already too late. There was nothing left to say. I had already made my choice, whether I had meant to or not. And now Mark was walking away because of it. He grabbed his jacket and moved toward the door, but before he left, he stopped and turned to face me one last time. "I hope you can find what you're looking for, Clara. But it's not with me." And with that, he was gone. I sank to my knees, my heart heavy with grief. I had lost him. Not just because of my love for Max, but because I hadn't been paying attention to what was happening around me. I hadn't noticed the way he was pulling away, the way his frustration was building. I hadn't seen that I had been choosing something else over him for too long. Max whined softly from beside me, and I pulled him close, burying my face in his fur. He was all I had left now. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing: I had lost Mark. And, in the end, I had lost him because of the very thing I thought I couldn't live without. I looked down at Max, his warm body comforting me in ways no one else could. And in that moment, I realized that love, true love, wasn't about choosing one over the other. It was about balance, and somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that. And now, I had lost them both.